You're listening to the Penteract Poetry Podcast, hosted by Anthony Etherin.
Hello, welcome to episode 8 of the Penteract Poetry Podcast. My guest this time is mathematician and poet Pedro Poitevin. I spoke with Pedro last month to discuss self-referential poems, poetry in translation, and our mutual interest in palindromic sonnets. I began by asking what first led him to poetry.
My origin story, I've heard that motif in your podcast. My origin story is a little unusual. As you know, I'm a mathematician by training. And as a matter of fact, I earned a living as a professor of mathematics at a local university in Massachusetts. And about 10 or so years ago, I began rather frequently waking up at night, in the middle of the night, to try to get one of my two sons back to sleep, either the wakeful toddler or the baby brother. One of my two sons back then, now I have three. And because I had my arms occupied, physically occupied, it was very hard for me to do what I would normally have done in a situation like that, which is I would have done some math. If you're suffering some insomnia and you're a mathematician, you tackle a problem or two, or you try to write a proof, and then all of a sudden you're sleepy and you sleep well and you have a sense of accomplishment and whatnot. But I couldn't really do that. And at the time, I started exploring what there was out there, and I discovered Twitter. And in Twitter, I came across a lovely, witty, playful community, back then a small community, of writers in Spanish, some of whom experimented with palindromes. And this appealed to me, and I quickly got very good at them. And at some point, a brilliant Mexican poet, Aurelio Etienne, discovered me, and he began giving me advice and issued a challenge. Why don't you attempt to write palindromic sonnets, he said. Now, I knew that sonnets were the kind of poetry that my grandfather recited back when I was growing up in his house in Guatemala, my home country. And I was very fond of the memory of the voice of my grandfather reciting by heart the sonnets of Francisco de Quevedo, a genius of wit, if there ever was one. So I was naturally excited about the idea of composing sonnets, but to be honest, I didn't really know that much about meter. So it took me a while. It took me a while to understand meter and prosody. And Aurelio was kind enough to take me under his wing and give me some pointers, some criticism, and he pointed me also in the direction of a very good book that I treasure, that helped me master the art of meter and prosody. Shortly thereafter, I began composing formal palindromes. And that is to say, palindromes that obey the strictures of meter and rhyme. And you'll be surprised, but there are a ton of palindrome writers in Spanish who, in spite of their strict adherence to the symmetry when it comes to the disposition of letters on the page, completely and blatantly disregard the strictures of prosody when it comes to composing what they call sonnets. So I quickly found a niche as a formal poet of palindromes, or a palindromic version of a formal poet, if you will.
You started with the palindromes and then had to learn how to write sonnets.
I started from the strictest of forms, right? And in fact, it was a journey of liberation for me in a way, with parallels with my own emotional life. But I succeeded with Aurelio's challenge of writing a palindromic sonnet and so on. And then I realized that my interest in formal poetry was more expansive, that I really wanted to liberate myself from the bidirectional straitjacket of of palindromic writing. Soon enough, I began composing sonnets in earnest, and I began exploring with other traditional forms until in this journey of liberation, I ended up writing even a few free verse poems here and there. And I think I like to say that I arrived at poetry out of intellectual curiosity, the sort of curiosity that had earlier driven me to deep aesthetic appreciation for the art of mathematical problem solving and mathematical proof. But in the process of exploring poetry, I discovered, much to my surprise, that I had arrived at poetry out of emotional need, masquerading as intellectual curiosity, which was a shocking revelation for me. I thought it was all intellectual curiosity and playfulness on my part, but there was something else going on. And there was something that the process of writing poetry clarifies to me in a way that I cannot do any other way. My own relationship with the world. So there's something sacred, truly sacred about the process of writing poetry.
As you know, I also write palindromic sonnets, but I started with the sonnet form, and learning to do palindromes came later.
Interesting.
Because I started as a musician, so formal poetry came from the music, and strict constraints came from formal poetry.
The opposite trajectory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I tried to write free verse when I first started writing poetry, and I just couldn't get my head around it. I thought, well, this is too much freedom.
I have a question for you, Anthony, which I always have found fascinating. I think that you and I have another striking opposition in our composition of palindromes, and is that I think you tend to favor starting in the middle, or at least in short palindromes, you tend to favor starting in the middle of the palindrome and working towards the resolution at the ends. And I tend to start with the beginning and the end. How do you do with sonnets? Do you start at the beginning or in the middle?
Oh, that's beginning at anything where I'm using meter. It has to be the beginning and the end, working towards the middle.
Anything working with meter.
Yeah.
Yes.
But with that, when you take meter out of it, I find it's a lot more comfortable to work from the middle outwards. Do you not do that at all?
No, I do it, but I think that it's probably an affectation that comes from reading at some point some extraordinarily strict standards proposed by, I forget if it was it's one of these famous poets who wrote a villanelle, a very famous villanelle. I forget right now. It'll come to me. But this famous poet suggested that the first words of the lines in a poem should be particularly memorable. And I think I imported that into the form of the palindrome. So I wanted the first word to be particularly good and the last word to be particularly good. And unfortunately, that limits a lot. Like I have to maneuver to be witty in the middle, and you have these amazing short palindromes that have amazingly memorable middles, and your wit is startling. How do you resolve the problem? How you resolve those palindromes is startling. For me, it's the reverse. I constrain myself to have a strong beginning and a strong ending, and then the wit is in the middle.
Is this a difference between Spanish and English? Or
Maybe.
Have you tried, maybe if you tried writing the English ones from the middle and the Spanish ones from the beginning and end, you'd find similar results.
Absolutely, I think you're right. I've succeeded with the few palindromes that are somewhat successful in English that I have written have been written from the middle outwards. It's true. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
it's interesting.
It's interesting. Yeah.
We've talked before about differences between Spanish and English when it comes to palindromes.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, you have more words that end with vowels in Spanish.
I think it does provide some advantages with meter, but the agglomeration of consonants in English makes for very cool breaking points between words that you do not have that kind of resource in Spanish. So you're far more constrained in the type of words that you can use in some strange way.
I'm sure we'll get back to palindromes, but while we're on this subject, you are also a translator.
That's right.
Which is, I think about that's a type of constrained writing, surely.
It is. Yeah, it is, and it is fascinating to me. There are poems that seem fundamentally untranslatable. It's just there. When a poem is like I was just reading a poem by one of my favorite writers in the English language. His name is Nemo Hale, and the title of his poem is "When Men Bow Down." And there's two internal rhymes there, like "when men bow down." How can I translate that into Spanish? I have no idea. It's just really hard to get that to come across in any reasonable translation.
So things like that are important to you in translation, because I see a lot of translated poetry where the translator will just stick to getting the meaning right, and they'll take out even rhyme or meter in order to just get the sentiment across.
Yes, it is important to me. I think my sensibility is very structuralist as a translator, because I think that the layers of poetry is fundamentally about the layering, the structural layering of the poem. That even poems that are written in free verse, what's really startling about them emotionally to me as a reader is the shocking revelations of structure, of the relationship between meaning and imagery and language. And when that disappears, because one is privileging just a literal content, rendering of content in a different language, I think that a lot of what is fundamentally beautiful about poetry is lost. So I tend to gravitate towards the poems that I feel like I can translate in a formal way, and formal in a very loose sense, not formal. They don't have to be formal poems. I've translated a lot of free verse, but I am attuned to structure.
And there's the aspect of it being a challenge, a puzzle, as well, if you're trying to actually replicate as many aspects of the original as possible.
That's right.
That's the mathematician in you.
Yes. As I said, I really truly arrived at poetry out of intellectual curiosity, and then I discovered that there was something else going on. But my first approximation was the mathematician's approximation, the desire to solve problems and to solve puzzles.
Yeah, and it's obviously developed from there, because one of the recent things you've been doing is improvised sonnets and decimers, which is, on the surface, it seems like the opposite of constraints, but then really it is a constraint, isn't it? It's a temporal constraint.
Exactly. It's a temporal constraint, and it's miserable. It's very difficult to function well in that constraint. Alexis Diaz-Pimienta is a master of that. And he taught me. It was very funny, because I was driving to New York City with him, taking him to an event that he was going to be at, and he would feed me lines and ask me to respond, but I was driving in the highway. It was absolutely impossible to improvise under those conditions, and I am lucky to be alive. So Alexis, please don't do that to me again. But here I am. I am still improvising. It's fun to do that as well.
And what do you tend towards in terms of subject matter, whether improvised or not? What do you like to write about? I know a lot of the poems you've written in English, anyway, have this self-referential quality.
That's one of the themes that crops up here and there in my writing. I think that I don't have a that's one of my difficulties as a practicing poet, is that I don't have a lot of thematic unity in my work. It really varies with the weather and with my inclinations, intellectual curiosity, all sorts of things. So I think that I am grounded in something that I think W.H. Auden said at some point. He said that form looks for content and content looks for form. And that intuition is what guides my engagement with poetry. So I think of the process of composing poetry as sort of like the dynamic conversions of these two tendencies. Maybe an idea gestates in my mind, and this idea is centered on some content that I want to write about, which is the instance of, I mean, that's what you're asking me about, right? Like I have some content in my mind that I want to write about. That can happen to me. But if so, my mind is actively looking for a structure, whether it's formal or not, that will help me give shape to that idea and to that content. But maybe I come up with the idea that I want to write in a particular structure. Like I just came up with a structure that I want to write in, and it's going to be miserable because it's a very long structure. It's related to the sestina and the sonnet. And then I have to find content to fit that structure. Those are the two primary modes of engagement. But what happens usually is that when the process begins, a more subtle series of linkages appear. Like the form, for example, might force my hand, and then other formal constraints arise because my hand has been forced in a particular way, or the content invites me to add further constraints, and so on. So it really is a mysterious process for me. What I avoid is writing about a certain things. Like I don't like writing a confessional poetry. It's not my thing. I've written one long confessional poem, and it was painful to write. And
it's meant to be, isn't
it? I think so. Yes. I don't know if it's as painful to read as it was to write, but it was painful to write.
Yeah, it doesn't lend itself to constraint, does it? Confessional poetry, because it's meant to be so much a genuine expression, emotional expression. Whereas with constraints, you're giving yourself over to the structure, and you're going to say things you don't actually mean. In fact, a lot of the time, just to fit the rules or the melody.
That's right. That's the only way that I could succeed in writing a confessional poem of that sort, was that it was really heavily structured. And so I lied a lot, but there was some confessional aspect of it, and that was very hard for me. So I tend to eschew the confessional mode. I do have a thing for self-referential poems, ars poetica in general, but yeah, I write about my dog, for example, and I suppose that's confessional in a way, but it's just in this other mode of composition, which is the improvisational mode.
And then when you're writing palindromes, I understand there's a tendency towards smut, and
there is, and I am not. That happens. I don't know what that is. I don't know if you have found thematic black holes in your composition in English of palindromes, but But in Spanish, it's just terrifyingly easy to write smut in palindromes.
It kind of is in English, so I have to consciously avoid it. And you told me your personal favorite Spanish palindromic sonnet is also your smuttiest.
Yes, that's right. It is, in fact, I think the first, no, maybe not the first, the second palindromic sonnet I wrote, and it turned out to be a threesome. So I didn't want it to be a threesome, it's certainly not confessional, but it was an palindromes force you to consider characters and so on, and so it ended up being about three Argentinian people, 2 men and 1 woman, and it's a very hot sonnet. What can I say? It was interesting to write and to realize that the best resolution for that sonnet was what it ended up being.
Do you have that poem with you?
Yeah, I do. I don't have a translation of it, but I can read it in Spanish, and you can. So I guess
it might have to just remain in Spanish. I don't know the rules on this podcast. If we can we can broadcast it.
Yeah, it's a sonnet about a threesome that never happened, or if it did not happen to me. But the protagonists are Argentines, which I could gather as I wrote the sonnet, right? And they spoke in a certain way when I read them. So when I read this sonnet, I try rendering it in an Argentinian accent. And I'm not trying to offend any sensibilities, but it just comes so naturally to me that way in my ear. So I try to pretend that I am an Argentine. It's hard to translate into English, but of course, being a palindrome. but it begins with the phrase banal love, or inverted love, and then banal, amor banal, and it ends with sodomy and laughter. And along the way, there are references to Eden, to sex, phalluses, sonnets, 2 men who aren't particularly well endowed, but have no trouble scoring, and a woman who clearly enjoys the attention of these 2 men. And in Spanish, it goes like this. Amor banal, la nueva levedad, y amodosita, leve risa y ola, fácil panal pasar a su maldad, revelé ver soneto, no la cola. La yací, risa y ojo sola, frágil, y el Edén, o por prisas otro corto, a otro le di. Si soy, será más ágil. ¿Ligás a mares? Yo, sí, del orto. A otro corto Sacir propone. Dele, y ligar falos, ojo. Y así rica, ya la loca lo note. Nos revela verdad. La musa raya plan, aplica falo y así revela a ti Sodoma y da de vela. Ve una llana broma.
Thank you. There's a cliche about when you're learning a new language, you just find the dictionary and just look up the root words. So now people can just read your palindromic sonnets.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it's what's surprising to me about this sonnet is that it is so easy to read. I don't know if you, but it's not choppy. Like palindromic poems tend to be very choppy because you need to introduce a lot of syntactic pauses to begin a new clause, and it's fascinating to me that the first quatrain is a single sentence, for example, and the second quatrain is 2.5 lines for a sentence, and then there's some kind of clause that's very short and very pithy and witty, and then there's dialogue that it's really surprising that that form, which is so constrained, allowed for such good flow or prosody.
Yeah, I was asked to read a Palindromic Sonnets on a different podcast recently, which is, I was happy to do it, but it's a challenge.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I read the Frankenstein one, which you probably know, and the thing about that is that intentionally uses short sentences because it's meant to be chopped up bits stuck together.
Exactly, but that's that formal perfection of that. It's great when form gives you a reason for how it presents it, and that's very important. Those are the subtleties that the translator in me loves and cannot get rid of in translation.
Yeah. So when did you start writing English poetry?
I think this started after Aurelio helped me figure out meter in Spanish. I almost at the same time began frequenting a forum on the internet, an internet forum called the Eratosphere, where I learned about formal poetry in English, and I did it concurrently. So I started writing sonnets in English and in Spanish at the same time. About the same time, 2010 or so.
What would you say the major differences in meter between Spanish and English? Or is it too hard to explain to someone like me who doesn't speak both?
That's a great question, and I do have some theory of the difference between them, at least as I experience them. So in English, the unit of analysis is the foot, right? So it's a very rhythmic conception of meter, where you may have sometimes you have trochaic feet, or iambic feet, or anapestic feet, or whatever you want, whatever dactylic feet. But the unit is the foot of analysis and of prosody. Like, that's how you hear poems in English. But in Spanish, you don't hear it the same way. It's funny. You sort of process the lines in terms of symmetry. So, for example, the hendecasyllabic verse differs from the IP verse in the following very subtle way. Both hendecasyllabics and IP lines have the last accent on, roughly speaking, the 10th syllable. Like in the case of an IP verse, if the foot at the beginning is not complete, you might have it on the 9th, or if it's trochaic or whatever. But in Spanish, what matters is that the 6th syllable is accented. Usually, the most common verse in Spanish has a feminine ending. So you have an extra syllable that's not accented. That's the 11th syllable. But the 10th one is accented. The 6th one has to be accented. Or if the 6th is not accented, then the 4th and the 8th are. So there's got to be some kind of symmetry. And the funny thing is that the tradition has picked out, by force of almost like cultural evolution, that some hendecasyllabic verses cohere very well, harmonize with each other according to the sensibilities of the Spanish prosody. So you know that, for example, one of the differences is a substitution, a trochaic substitution on the 3rd foot in English is perfectly acceptable in an IP line. In a Spanish verse, the equivalent of that would be murder. It just doesn't work. It's awful to have the 5th syllable accented followed by a 6th syllable that's weak. Sounds horrible in Spanish. I mean, it doesn't sound horrible for the line itself. If you have all the lines do the same thing, it's perfect. The problem is when you mix that specific line with other lines that keep the traditional forms. So it's sort of like a delayed harmony in time. You want to experience the echo of the previous lines. When you hear a line, you want to hear an echo of the structure of the lines.
That's interesting. You've obviously thought a lot about this. I love your formal poems in English and in Spanish, from what I can gather. There's one in particular that I thought you could read, which is your Villanelle.
Oh, sure, that Villanelle. Yeah, so that's one of my self-referential poems, that Villanelle. And I don't know if you want to hear about the process of writing that, but I think it's an interesting process. We talked about how things come about, and that one was special. I was driving home and I heard that line came to me. I feel the memory of writing you. And I noticed, oh, it's perfect IP. It's a beautiful line. I feel the memory of writing you. And I had recently written a sonnet that was a self-referential sonnet that described itself. It consisted entirely of true statements about the sonnet, how many lines, how many sentences it had, how many words it had, how many letters it had, etc. And it was pleasant to write and lovely to read, but it didn't completely move me. So I had issued a challenge to myself to write a poem that was self-referential, but that moved me. And when I heard that line as I was driving home, I feel the memory of writing you, I knew that contained elements that could force my hand in that direction, to write a self-referential poem that would somehow move me. And I noticed also that the line memory being there called me to write a Villanelle, because I knew, it's a cliche now to notice these things, but the construction, memory is reconstructed. Every time that you remember something, you're reconstructing the memory. Is something that cognitive science has taught us about memory. The memory is not like watching a film of what happened in the past, but it is rather like reconstructing some kind of narrative structure. So I knew that I needed to use that line several times in the poem. So the form that best accommodated that line in my mind was the Villanelle. So that's how it was born.
It's a difficult form, though.
It's a very difficult form. So when I wrote it, at first I felt like it was a very, I guess, a recursively narcissistic poem, because it's about itself and it's infinitely about itself. But I can't help but be somewhat moved when I write it, because it actually describes very accurately the sensation of having written it and the experience of writing it. So it's an interesting poem for me. So here it goes. I feel the memory of writing you. I feel the memory of writing you, beginning to carve out its riverbed deep in the shadow of my passing through. How after scanning you beneath, I flew a little lower, how I turned my head. I feel the memory of writing you, my labyrinthine road. I had no clue how to begin or end before I read, deep in the shadow of my passing through, the story I demanded to be true. In each one of the knots along the thread, I feel the memory of writing you. The moment when I felt your pulse, I knew. And as you slowly found your form, I shed deep in the shadow of my passing through a love song to the love song that you drew with words I'd say to words I hadn't said. I feel the memory of writing you deep in the shadow of my passing through.
Thank you. It's a really great poem.
Thank you.
Well, since we're talking about formal poetry and we've talked about constraint-based poetry, you've even mentioned free verse, we should talk about the state of contemporary poetry in general.
Well, it's a hard question. I don't know what to say. I mean, I have lots of thoughts. I can tell you that I'm not a fan of the big journals in general. I think that they publish a lot of poems that I just don't enjoy and don't understand. And this is even though I consider myself a generous and acute reader of poetry. I suppose that I just never got myself attuned to the poetic sensibilities of the members of the more established community, like the poetic establishment in my adopted country, in the United States. I don't know much about the UK, but occasionally I'm very smitten with poems that appear, for example, in New York Review of Books. I think the editor has good taste. Rattle magazine also occasionally publishes things that I find very moving.
They published your Villa Now.
They published my Villa Now, which was fantastic. I was very happy because I really like them. I really like and I love the rejection letters as well. When I get rejected by Rattle, I feel some I feel genuine. I feel that the rejection is a genuine rejection. That is not one of those pro forma rejections that you get all the time.
Which almost seem to be intentionally bad, don't they?
They do seem intentionally bad. But I think that I discover poetry these days. I trust to discover better poetry via a few select individuals on social media whose judgments I trust and whose aesthetic sensibilities I am closer to than I do by subscribing to magazines. So I discovered lovely things that are happening all over the place that I had no idea were there, because it's very hard to find those people in established magazines. So I'm not sure what that is about. I think there's sociological reasons that make it very difficult, no matter who is on top, for a variety of poetic styles to be broadcast. So there's some homogenizing effect of these sociological forces, of like the Matthew effect, the rich get richer and the poor stay poor, right? But I don't know. I'm a formal poet and an experimental poet, but I really do enjoy and appreciate the best exemplars of an incredibly vast array of poetic programs. And I'm kind of constitutionally opposed to the narrow programmatic manifestos of every single poetic movement. As a mathematician, the metaphor that is natural to me and comes to mind about mathematics is that mathematics is like a mountain range. And so maybe the algebraists are climbing mountain K2, right? And the analysts are climbing Mount Everest. But both camps are interested in the progress that the other camp is making. They want to learn the news of what's going on the other side of the mountain range. And they don't want to dynamite the other mountain because the other guys are on the wrong side of the mountain or the mountain range. It seems to me that in poetry, there's a lot more territoriality of that sort, where people say, oh, those guys are climbing K2. I wish I could just dynamite K2 out of existence.
Yeah, absolutely. This is absolutely right.
So, but it's the other thing that I gotta say is that I think that we have developed as a community of poets an unhealthy relationship with innovation. And I don't know. It seems to me that I'm an experimental poet, and I have a love of innovation. I love innovation, but at least on this side of the Atlantic, it seems to me that we have forgotten that mastery is the most important achievement in poetry, and that mastery doesn't usually come with one's first attempt at something. So I think that a poet ought not aspire to be the first poet to do X, but to be the last poet to do X. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, who's going to do what Christian Brook did with Eunoia? I don't know. I don't think it makes sense to attempt to do what he did with Eunoia.
There's no point trying to do that again, is there?
Exactly.
Yeah.
He achieved a mastery, right? And I think, in the poetry world, a lot of what you see is a lot of examples of people who do a tiny little variation on a form, for example, and all of a sudden, and variations that sometimes flaunt looseness or metrical incompetence, to be sure. And all of a sudden, we have them crowned because of an innovative use of form. And on the other hand, there are people, and there are institutions, or at least mountains in the mountain range that are inexhaustible. Like formal poetry has some inexhaustibility to it. Richard Wilbur attained a level of mastery that is incredible. He recently passed, and but today we have Alicia Stallings, and we have Rina Espaillat and Nemo Hill, and these people have achieved an incredible level of mastery of their craft and their poetry. And in free verse, there are masters. There are people who are extremely good. I'm just less qualified to evaluate poets that write in free verse, but I do know that some of my favorite poems are in free verse. Like there's this poem by Ross Gay called Burial, which is free verse, and I am blown away by that poem. It never appeared in Poetry Magazine or in any, in one of those distinguished journals that people talk about. But there are fantastic things, fantastic exemplars, even of the kinds of schools, poetic schools, that I am not attracted to. Like, for example, confessional poetry is not my thing, but there are confessional poems out there that are brilliant. And the MFA clique, I'm always, I'm not a fan of the homogeneity of the kind of poetry produced by people who graduate from MFAs and listen to each other's poems and read each other's poems and write each other's poems over and over again. But there are some exemplars, and they are fantastic. For me, the problem is that we have lost track of what matters most, which is mastery. I think that's the big problem.
And anything done well is amazing, no matter what it is. I think of Johnny Cash. I hate country music. I hate country music.
Me too.
Everyone should. But you've got to love Johnny Cash.
Absolutely. It's unbelievable, right? He's awesome. Exactly.
Just because he's a master. So
he's a master.
That's fine.
Yeah.
We should talk about Twitter, because it's how I started to get an audience, which is largely down to you noticing me on Twitter and helping me out.
I discovered you.
Discovered me.
Yeah.
It's an interesting place, Twitter.
It is an interesting place. It was different from when I remember at the beginning. It was more playful and something akin to what do you call this? Like universal expansion has happened, right? Like accelerating universal expansion. People are farther and farther apart from each other as time goes on. But Twitter is a place where I learned poetry. and frankly, it's where I publish most of my poetry. I don't submit poetry very often to journals, and I do publish it on Twitter because I have an audience of people that I respect and admire. Many of them are significantly more accomplished than I am. So it is an honor for me to write and post something for them, because I know that they sometimes will like it. And if I write a poem, I feel an obligation sometimes to give it a chance to go somewhere. Even it's an odd thing to say, but I feel an obligation to the poem. You know what I mean? Like for me, what matters most is the process. Like the process of writing a poem is what really is meaningful to me. But once the poem is there and it's lying around, and it has been lying around for a long time, I feel like, oh my gosh, it should get out there. It should have a chance to be read. And Twitter provides me sometimes with that option of letting go of a poem that has been on my shelf for a long amount of time.
Yeah, for me, it's the immediacy. I don't want. I'm very impatient, actually. I don't want to send a poem off to a journal and then wait. I mean, sometimes you can be waiting 6-7 months to get.
That's right. I remember when we were sending out those bilingual poems we wrote, especially that beautiful pair of sonnets that we should get out there someday. Oh my gosh, it was such an experience to be waiting and waiting for people to get back to us.
And also, you're going to get most of the time you're going to get more readers posting it on Twitter than having it in a journal. I mean, it depends, of course.
It depends on the time of day and things like that. That's one of the things that I don't trust about Twitter. I know that there is. I sort of disagree with this meritocratic idealism that if you're good at something and you get attention in today's economy, it's a sign that you're really good. I don't think so. I think that there's some kind of Matthew effect, like if you have a sufficiently large audience and you tweet at the right moment, you're gonna get a lot of likes. One of the experiments I've done is I've tweeted the same poem twice or 3 times, and the results are all over the place, depending on the day, depending on the time, I didn't check what is the right time because I don't care, but it's not so reliable an indicator of quality. Popularity is definitely not a reliable indicator of quality, even at the level of one's own output. Like some of the stupidest tweets I've ever made are more popular than some of the smartest ones.
Yeah, I've had that too. It's really depressing.
Yeah, it's depressing.
I can spend months working on an epic and it'll get 10 likes, and then I'll just do a one-liner gets 1,000.
Yes, that happens a lot. So yeah, I don't trust it so much. But it is what it is, and it's a good tool for people who are not. I'm not a professional poet. I'm not pursuing celebrity. Right? Twitter is a place where I just shed my poems. I'm a mathematician, so I have a different relationship to poetry, and Twitter is a place where I can just publish my poems.
You engage with the political Twitter a bit more than I do. I try to avoid any time I've said something that's just a personal opinion, I seem to get hate. So I've decided to stop doing that. It's an aggressive place at times.
It is an aggressive place. Yeah. I guess I do. I try not to, but it's sometimes it's difficult not to not to express some opinions. but not too much. I think I'm a little bit like you. There are a lot of people out there that are constantly engaged with politics, and I let most everything go. It's not a medium that lends itself to argument, because it promotes sarcasm and snide comments, and it brings out curt replies, and just
It's the brevity,
the brevity.
It's easy to misinterpret, and it's easy to be misinterpreted.
Exactly. And it's very tempting to misinterpret, and it's very tempting to be indignant. So it's not conducive to exercising virtue. It's not a good place for that. But perhaps because of it, sometimes I do engage in political argument. Because it's good to have a shock to one system, right? Like, oh, okay, so I'm going to get some hate now. How am I going to handle it? Am I going to handle it well? Is it going to make me despondent and indignant, or am I going to be philosophical about it? So it's okay.
Well, I hope you continue posting poems there anyway. So, well, what else are you doing then? So what's next for you in terms of poetry?
So, oh God, what is next? So I have a couple of projects. One of them is more serious than the other, and it's the more recent one. I was mentioning it earlier that I had this idea of inventing a form, or at least exploring a form that I don't think has been explored, which is related to the sestina and to the sonnet. So I'm very excited about that exploration. It's going to be painful because the structural constraints are extraordinary, and because of the length of the poem. It's going to be a long poem, which is very hard. I already wrote two very long poems, sonnet crowns, and they were very hard to write. Perhaps one of them, specifically the confessional one, was the hardest poem I've ever written. And I've written to 10 million palindromic sonnets in Spanish, so 10,000,006 or so. But yeah, that one was very hard, and so this one is presenting me with that degree of challenge, and I'm looking forward to engaging with that challenge. Another one is I decided to attempt to write either a chapbook or a book of poems that is the whole chapbook or book a palindrome, a single palindrome, but the individual poems are not.
So big challenges again. Yeah,
very, very deep constraints. One is more than the other, more constrained than the other. But those are two projects. And then I have a book that I am editing in Spanish, something called Fórmulas más o menos verdaderas, which is sort of like more or less true formulas, formulas of varying degrees of truth. And in it was sort of like the only common thread that I could find in all of my poetry. So it's kind of an anthology of my own poetry. And I've noticed that some of my projects, so the word formula was very appealing to me because there's a lot of form in it. And one of the projects in particular, one of the chapters, is about writing the minimal decima. So a decima is a traditional form in the Spanish language consisting of 10 lines with a certain rhyme scheme and a certain meter. And I wanted to write decimas that were progressively shorter in the number of symbols used. So first there were letters, and then eventually somebody started on Twitter. This was kind of a joint project with other people, but a competition, as it were. I ended up, people started using mathematical symbols. Instead of writing 3, for example, they would write the numeral 3 and they counted it as a single symbol. So I allowed myself to write down using mathematical symbols, and I ended up writing down true formulas. I think I got down to 25. So it's 25 symbols, mathematical symbols in 1 decimal. And those 25 symbols express some kind of true formula who's about the number 25. So that was the project. So,
I remember this. It's fantastic.
Yeah,
It really is.
It was really hard, but that turned out to be an interesting way to find a common thread to all of my poetry, because I could talk about the sonnet crowns as also formulas that were exploring varying degrees of truth, and so I have that book, and I would like to publish it at some point in the near future.
Excellent. Pedro, thank you so much for talking to me. It's been really good. It's always good talking to you.
Oh, it's always good talking to you, Anthony. I love our conversations, and it's an honor to be with you.
To discover more, visit us at penteractpress.com.